Welcome to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I'm your host, Larissa Napolitan, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team. My hope is to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. One of my favorite parts of the show is highlighting the incredible stories of districts across the country as they bring the MTSS framework to life. And it's not just about sharing successes, though we have those. We love to dig into what the challenges were, the growth, and the lessons we learn along the way. And so today I am thrilled to welcome back a very special guest, Theresa Donohue from Plainview Old Beth Page in New York on Long Island, correct?
Yes, we're on Long Island.
And a few years ago, I had a chance to chat with Theresa and her superintendent,
Dr. Mary O'Mara.
Dr. Mary. And she, at the time, they shared about how they were just beginning their MTSS journey. And now she's back to reflect on the progress that they've made, the impact of the work, and some insights she gained along the way. So, Theresa, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I have to say, I'm excited and hopeful, I have a lot of hope, for the continuation of what we've been doing. It's really been really rewarding.
Yeah. It's in education, like we love to sit around and we can talk about the problems and the challenges and the things that we face every day. It's easy to do that. And so it's so fun then to talk about like when we can be hopeful and be excited about.
It doesn't mean that there still aren't challenges, right? And,
yes.
and problems. I think we'll always have those. That's part of what we're in, We deal with kids and they're different, so you're always going to have problems and challenges. But I feel like at the same time, some of like the logistical challenges that we were facing, we've really worked a lot to kind of move forward and overcome them. So that's great.
Well, so remind the listeners sort of a little bit about Plainview Old Beth Page, just kind of the context and demographics that we're talking about.
Sure.
Today.
So we are, I would say, a middle to large district, about 40 miles east of Manhattan. We are in Nassau County. We are a growing district. We have grown exponentially over the last 5 years, and we have a varied population. Our demographics are changing, but we're a very high performing district. But at the same time, 4 years ago, we partnered with Branching Minds to create our MTSS plan. We did that for a full year. And then the year we implemented it, they also hired me to be the executive director of MTSS data and assessments and, start this journey together. So, we all kind of came in together. The plan was new. My position was new. Branching Minds obviously was new to the district, and rolling that out over the last, it'll be 3 years in the fall. We've learned a lot and we've grown a lot. And then of course there's more for us to do still.
Well, so first of all, when you think about your journey as a leader, what first drew you to this work? And how has that shaped how you think about supporting students through MTSS?
Yeah, I think a lot. I started my career as an English teacher in New York. I was a middle school English teacher, and we focused a lot on data because at the time the New York State tests had just started. I'm dating myself, right? But they had just come out, and so analyzing that data and using it to drive our instruction was something that I've always did as a teacher. Then I spent some time as different types of administrators. I was an MYP coordinator. I was an assistant principal in middle schools, dealing with, students on IST teams, students that were struggling for various reasons. I was a humanities director, and I think that my work as an assistant principal probably is what really helped me most to understand different ways we can support students, because with MTSS, it's not just the grades. There's so much more that goes into it. So when this position was created and I applied for it, I felt like it spoke to a lot of my strengths as a teacher and then as an administrator, and I think that's what kind of drew me to it. And the more I went through my position and grew into the position because it was newly created, I kind of was able to forge my own path with it. It's helped me understand a lot about, working with adults, working with children, leading meetings, different types of accommodations and how we can support students. And then on a whole separate side of it is, how can we use the data to help us most? And having the data in a centralized location obviously is super helpful to be able to see that historical data over time. So yeah, that's pretty
Yeah. Well, and I think when you sit in lots of different positions as a leader, you gain perspective of this is where MTSS applies in this way and where this is how it applies in this way. And I think, I often thought as myself as sitting in the classroom, I had one perspective. And then when you step out of that role and into others, you begin to see sort of the system as a whole, how it all should work, how it should work together. It might not always be doing that.
Yeah.
And so then you can step into a role like MTSS. And I'm speaking this sort of as, we have a lot of listeners that are the MTSS person in their school or their district. And it can be a lonely position at times. So it's good to talk about this and the fact of knowing the hard work that it takes to bring all those different perspectives together. Because you often are probably sitting in meetings, like leading meetings with people who come at it with a different perspective. So
yeah, and that actually, one of the things that this year, more so than ever, I was invited to attend and be a part of more and more MTSS meetings. And that, to me is really where the rubber meets the road, right? That's when we can really problem solve together and look at all the different things and what are we doing as a team to best support this student, this family, and are we communicating that well enough? And what is the student saying? Are we getting their perspective, especially in the secondary buildings? So yeah, it's been an evolution. The position, my involvement with the teams has grown, each year that I'm in the position.
Yeah. So let's take a little bit of step back and kind of look at, when you look at where your district was with MTSS a few years ago versus where you are today, what does that evolution feel like from the inside? And has there been a moment or even a challenge that made you say, we need to do things differently? Or did you have pivots within that journey?
Yeah, yes. It's like any other journey, right? You have peaks and valleys. But I think first and foremost, what was realized very early was that we needed a system that the whole district was functioning under, and we needed a point person for that system. And that all happened before I even got here. I think that Dr. O'Meara having the foresight to do that really is what drives the plan. So a dedicated person that is available. One of the things that I feel really helped us is more so this year than previous years, because you learn, you adjust, you learn, you adjust. So, this summer I really focused on being, number one, making sure I was very clear with expectations for teachers and for administrators. And I created like a monthly MTSS calendar, and I made sure to blast it out the first day of every month. It was on my calendar, send your MTSS tip out. And then I also would have open office hours monthly for teachers, administrators that wanted to talk to me about anything. It could be about a student. It could be about the platform. It could be about finding an intervention together. Or there's no intervention that fits my needs in the library. Can we add one? Little things like that. And that constant follow-up, like I'm not going away. And, and I'm sure some people would get the email and roll their eyes. I understand that. We're a large district. I understand that. But I also feel like at times it would be like, okay, I can do this. Or, oh, I didn't realize I could run this report and find out the kids that I have that get AIS services. That's great. I didn't know that. Or teachers would say, listen, this would be a really helpful tip. Could you use this in your calendar? And I'd be like, yes, for next year, I have something to do. So I think those are the things that really kind of pushed it forward. And I think that just comes from, being in education for as long as I have and like being involved with change and getting adults to move forward. That itself, is something that you need to understand.
Yeah. Well, and I have to say, I mean, it's one of those things where I'm sure that the office hours and the MTSS tip, some of those things, ideas of like, how can I make sure give a place for people to connect with me, or how can I make sure to kind of continue to drop learnings for people? Those are, I think, as you evolve into the work, you begin to realize of like, okay, I need sustainable ways to make sure that this continues.
Yeah.
not just one meeting at the beginning of the year,
Right.
but
Yeah. No,
throughout.
it can't be one B. And honestly, it's, you come in superintendent's conference day. It's one day. You're really focused on what you're doing the next day, which is when the students come. It becomes this information overload.
Uh-huh.
So it has to be chunked. Anytime we give information out to any learner, they need it chunked almost,
Yeah.
and little reminders and things they can do right then and there. So that's something that I've tried to focus on, over the last 3 years.
As an instructional coach, I used to do this Tech Tip Tuesdays, and in school, you have all kinds of range of people who have technology experience. And I did a video about how to split your screen and like how to do these different things.
Yeah.
And I had this one teacher, he'd been doing it a long time, and he's like, this is so helpful. I feel like teachers feel supported in that of just, here's something, a nugget for me to absorb. Because you're right. I think at the beginning of the year, when we dump everything, and I think even just different PD days throughout the year, even those days there's so much happening that
Yeah.
it's hard to absorb some of that learning in a way that
Right.
makes sense. And so
Right.
that I love that idea. I just want to like pinpoint it for our listeners of like an MTSS. Did you say you do it monthly or weekly?
The tip is monthly.
Okay. Yeah. And
So-
that's pretty doable, I think.
Yeah, totally. And then what I also would make sure is, or I'd ask that the building principals at their monthly faculty meetings make sure they highlight that same tip. So I push it out at the beginning of the month, and then whenever their faculty meeting is, they are also making sure they highlight it as well. So they're hearing it more than once. And if, the chairs and the directors want to jump on board at their department meetings, now they're hearing it 3 times a month. So, they definitely hear MTSS probably more than they've ever in their lives, which some probably don't love, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm okay with it.
Okay, so let's talk of some of the impact here. Is that there's a number that kind of stands out from, some information I got, is that there has been a 318% increase in student goals
Yeah.
set in a single
Amazing.
year.
It's amazing. I asked our customer consultant, Jackie, I was putting together agenda for my last district MTSS meeting. And I said, can you just give me some quick data? I want to be able to share with the committee the work that how we've done this year. And she was like, I've been waiting to send this to you. It's amazing. That blew me. I read it and I was almost giddy. I'm such a nerd, I was giddy. I'm a nerd.
Well, and thinking about how, like, what that really means on the ground is that in a whole year, students that may have not necessarily received the support, been identified, hey, I need a goal, I need some interventions and need a goal set to work towards, then that's a huge increase, the amount of students that are getting support.
So our goal this year internally was fidelity. We really wanted to make sure we were using the platform to track what we were doing. So that goal was fidelity. It was make sure when you have a meeting, I think it was twofold for the growth of the goals. One was that we made sure that all of our assistant principals understood how to use the meeting assistant, which was huge because our elementary assistant principals weren't initially using it. So I worked with all the elementary assistant principals to make sure they understood how to run a meeting using the meeting assistant, and they hit the ground running with it. They absolutely loved it. They also made sure that they were creating goals at all of those meetings. So they were logging the meetings, and at those meetings, they were logging the goals in Branching Minds rather than on another spreadsheet. So I do feel like there were goals that were being made, but we had no way to know when or where they were. And being that the platform was available to us, and we understood that this year, that's our goal is to use it effectively. That I think is what drove the dramatic increase. And it's wonderful to see. I mean, it really is.
Yeah. And I think it's good to know that in the sense of there were interventions happening and students maybe were getting support, but maybe not to the level that they could be. We're having record of are students progressing? And I think that's so important for us to take note of, is that when you're doing the MTSS work, it can feel, if you're not recording it, if you're not documenting it, it can feel like you're spinning your wheels. And are we making a difference? Are students progressing? And if you don't have a great way to track it, some kind of platform or something to make sure that you know what's happening. And you at the district level, you need to be able to say to your district level team or to your supervisors, hey, here's the work that's happening. And it's so much easier. And I would say this even too, like communicating to parents of like, yes, we're doing the work. Here's the layout. We talk a lot about how parents want to see some more transparency. If you have a way to do that, it's so much easier.
Definitely. 100%.
Okay. So, I mean, you kind of mentioned this before about how your teachers are hearing MTSS more in their lives than maybe they ever have. So a lot of this work so much of this work is a culture change, and I think in education, there's a lot of squeaky wheels. Even just turning that wheel is a lot harder when you've had teachers that have been doing this a long time. But how did you build that trust with your teams and start to move the needle and saying, rather than it just MTSS is just another thing we're doing, which maybe there's people that said that in the beginning, or this is what we need to do to do the right thing for kids?
Yeah. Well, I think it's definitely twofold. In the beginning, obviously, they didn't, not only they didn't, I don't want to say they, I think overall we didn't have a deep understanding of MTSS. So we had to create that, and they didn't know me. So I needed to create relationships with people so that they could trust me to be able to help them understand what MTSS means. So, separate and aside from branching minds, it was just helping teachers have a deeper understanding of what MTSS is. I did that through, PDs throughout the course of my first year, where they got to know me, they got to know what MTSS means. And then the elephant in the room was the word data. And getting teachers to understand that data isn't always scary, and that we could look at different pieces of information and use those pieces to help students, So that, I think, was a huge shift. And I think one of the greatest things that happened this year was that we worked with our local BOCES, and we brought in DataWise as well, the DataWise protocol, and we created teams in each of our buildings, chaired by the building principal, and then they picked teachers. And we went through the whole DataWise protocol throughout the year, meeting with the trainers from BOCES and implementing what we learned in the buildings. And of course, it worked hand in hand with what we were doing, within MTSS. And that, I think, also helped us this year more so than ever. We had, veteran teachers that, had been teaching for, 20, 22 years, who knew what they were doing. But then when we really started to dig into the data, and one of the things that we used was the cohort assessment performance report. And what we did was we took that and we would, see how they did on the different strands. And then from there, we would create our small group instruction topics. And then we would take that and we would plug it into Magic School and create very specific lessons to work with those small groups. And that, I'm just thinking of this one teacher that was there who, a bit of, he was a louder teacher, veteran teacher. He was like, I feel rejuvenated, to the point where, he went and spoke at a BOCES kickoff meeting for next year's cohort of DataWise people. So, that getting a veteran teacher to say data's not scary and look at all the good we did, and their results on their spring NWEA were through the roof. I mean, the growth that we saw in that one building in that specific grade level was huge. It's very impactful. So I think, the trust is important. The breaking things down is important. The being there with people along the way is important. The consistency is important. So all of those things really is what really fostered the success we saw this year.
Yeah. For our listeners, can you explain a little bit what DataWise is? Is it a protocol?
Yeah, it's a protocol. It's a 8-step protocol on how you approach data and problem solving. There's 8 different steps. It's defined by a swoosh. That's why I'm making that with the DataWise swoosh. I feel like it came out of Harvard Graduate School a few years ago, but it's just a very systematic way to approach analyzing data and then implementing change. And it's cyclical, much like MTSS is, and you're constantly revisiting. But, we didn't have something like that. This created a formal language consistently across the district, and we didn't necessarily have something like that. So we found that this coupled with the work we had done previously surrounding MTSS, it allowed us to really kind of not be as afraid to look at data, take it away from looking at me as the teacher to looking at what can I do to support my children, in my classroom. That was I would say one of the biggest culture shifts that we saw, this past year as well. So, it was a few different things.
I mean, I think that that's such an important thing to note is having some kind of protocol around data because, and I've talked about this many times before, is that it can feel so personal as a teacher when you look at your classroom data compared to somebody else's classroom data. And it can there's biases and personal
Sure.
things that can get in the way. Cause I don't know, we can't deny that teaching is personal in many ways. And so it's so important to have a protocol to look at that. And I think probably that makes a huge difference for teachers maybe have been doing it a long time and have a lot of baggage. I think we all have PTSD from different
Yeah,
seasons.
absolutely.
And maybe No Child Left Behind has left us. Like, it's definitely weird to talk about data. So I love that. I love that you kind of noticed that was a significant need for your teams. So I mean, let's talk a little bit about interventions. And you talked a little bit about how you'd form small groups and set goals. Maybe talk a little bit about what's changed in that intervention process for your team, and maybe how your team is making that call and which interventions to use. What does that process look like, whether to see what's working and maybe what's making a difference for students?
Yeah, one of the things that we did very early on was dig into the library and try and customize it as best we could for our district. So I would say 2 summers ago, I ran a summer curriculum writing where we had teachers from K through the high school work in bands to kind of go through the library and school favorite interventions that they knew that their colleagues would use consistently to help students. So we did that. So that was like our first iteration, and we shared that out and how to find those interventions. But then secondly, we started adding interventions that we knew we used in the classroom. And I'm thinking specifically, and this would come usually organically. People would reach out to me via email or during my office hours and say, listen, I'm using this protocol in the classroom, but it's not in Branching Minds, so I can't track it. And I want to be able to assign it to this group. Help me out. Of course, let's get it in there. We're asking you, this is what we're wanting you to do. We want to make sure that the tools that we have are helping you and you're not coming up with a blocker. So adding our interventions that teachers were using in the classroom, I think that really helped too, because it's theirs. This is like, and I feel like this is where the MTSS piece was, I don't want to say hard for them to understand in the beginning, but we said to them, listen, you're doing things in your classroom you don't even realize. And now I feel like this year, more so than ever, they realized and they were like, oh, but it's not here. And I'm like, well, let me put it there. Let's get it in there, And I think that helped. And I never say, I'm never the one that says you should use this intervention. I make suggestions, if we're at a meeting, have you tried this? Have you tried that? Let's try this. But we leave it up to the teachers, specifically the classroom teachers, to put their tier 1 interventions in. And then, we follow our plan, which is you put your intervention in, you track it for 6 weeks. I show them how to check it off. And then we look at the data. What is going on in our classroom? Do we need to change it? Do we need to change the frequency, the duration, or maybe a new type of intervention? And until we get to that next screener. And then once we ingest that data, then we go, okay, well, did it work? Did it not? Do we need to now bring this student to an individual meeting and get more of a team approach to helping him or her with whatever it is they're struggling with?
Yeah. Well, and I think I think you named something that's really important for MTSS leaders is to get that buy-in, is to name the things that the teachers are already doing. You're already using these great interventions. Let's just add them to the library. That way you can track and have that information. And then also providing it in a way district-wide allows for collaboration. Oh, here's a really great intervention that this school didn't know about, but this one is doing. And I think that kind of unifies everybody. And it's also a relief of like, okay, MTSS isn't just a way to tell me all the things I'm not doing to meet the needs of my students, but it's saying, let's just track it and show that we're doing the things that we need to do.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Okay, so what would you say has been the most significant impact of this improved MTSS work?
There's so many data points. There's so many. I think that
You can even name like 2 or 3. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be the most.
Obviously, the growth of the goals is huge. We didn't have that. We didn't have students with intervention plans that needed intervention plans. That's a huge growth. The meeting assistant and the number of meetings that we're having that are being tracked is fantastic. And I think just the teachers logging into the platform consistently. And I would go in and say, see when teachers logged in, and it would be like they logged in 6 months ago. And we're not seeing that necessarily anymore. Teachers are in there. Some teachers are in there much more frequently if they're service providers or if, they're counselors. But everybody is in the platform at least 3 times a year, if not more. And I think that's great. Some of the data on what interventions we're using and the return of investment on those interventions is amazing data too. How we're using IXL, how we're using Lexia, and how many minutes the students are on there and the growth that we're seeing with that. So, those are all been great. We're, shouting out teachers that are on there doing really good work. I shared that with the principals and I said, you should, give them a little shout out, or something along those lines. So it's been good to see, And I always said change takes 3 to 5 years. Like, I know that. I've been in places where we've brought programs in and nothing happens in year 1 or 2. It just doesn't. You're learning. Everyone's learning. So it's nice to see that, with 3 years, full years, the growth we've made and where we can continue to go from here.
Yeah. Well, and I want to name probably your growth, I would say, knowing that I've spoken with your superintendent, is that the support, having that system level support from the district level to make this work happen is so important. Knowing that you have someone at your back believes in the work and believes in the work that you're doing. So I do think that makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
In being able to implement and to sort of see that through, right? See it through the 3 to, the learning curve. What would you say when you think about just thinking about this MTSS work? Can you think of places or like you named that one teacher that had been teaching for a long time and just the impact on their students? Are there other places where you see pockets of like sort of that lag measure of like, oh, here's where we're seeing the result of this hard?
Yeah, I think one of the things too that we find, we give the SECA 3 times a year in our secondary buildings. And have now for 3 years. So we have a lot of data there. And that's been really helpful for our SEL and our mental health staff. And as well as putting in an executive functioning, I don't want to call it a curriculum, but having a plan to address executive functioning, how we have taken what our own students are telling us, how they are struggling, and then trying to put whole scale, not even interventions, but programs in place to help the students with what they're struggling with the most. Consistently we get the students telling us they struggle with, goal management, time management, and schoolwork. Those are the 3 areas that we consistently see kids struggling with. And so working with our leaders to come up with ways to help them, that has been, I think, really impactful for everyone. So, instructionally and with our mental health staff, that's been really, really helpful and very impactful. The SECA data and that SECA report is huge.
Gives insight into ways.
Huge insight.
Yeah.
And even in areas, what I find interesting is I meet, with the building principals as well. We review our data 3 times a year. And specifically with the high school principal, we focus a lot on that SECA data. And even the areas where kids say, yeah, they're fine, within that area, there's still 4 different sub areas. And within those, sometimes they struggle within that one domain. So it's not like you can just say, okay, they're fine. When you still have 50% of your kids saying we struggle with it, even though it wasn't enough to take that whole measure and make it, that's still a significant amount. So what can we do to support our students there? It's been, and then you could break it down even further. Is this just a 9th grade issue? Is it transition? Do we need to work better on getting, in September and helping our 9th graders? It's been really helpful and impactful.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that rough transition to 9th grade is always
tough.
Tough. It's a tough one. So let's kind of close with this. If there's a district leader, an MTSS leader listening to this, and they're at that very beginning part of the journey, what's one thing that you would want them to hear? Maybe something you would have wanted to hear at the beginning, and then maybe talk a little bit about where you see what are the next steps that for Plainview Old Beth Page.
I think it's number one, don't take anything personally. So I learned that very quickly in my administrative career, don't take anything personally, so that's first and foremost. But joking aside, I think it's just go slow. You need to go slow, and you need to be able to read a room and meet learners where they're at. I mean, that's just learning 101. I very quickly learned that preaching after school to 200 people in an auditorium, I'm not going to get the desired results. It's just not going to happen. I could be the Knicks, and it's not going to work. Well, maybe not the Knicks in New York, but it's not working. It's not working. Yeah. So, don't take anything personally. Go small, go slow rather, and be available. I think that's those three things I think are really important. And then where do we go from here? I think one of the things that we kind of uncovered this year that we're going to be using next year, we didn't have a mechanism to screen for behaviors necessarily. So we worked a lot on academics and attendance, but behaviors didn't. So actually next year we're going to be using that CERCES tool with it. I'm excited for that. I know that our school psychologists are excited for that as well. Because we were using to run like a mini BASC, which you really can't. That's more of a diagnostic. We needed the screening tool for that. So I'm excited to see how we can start implementing that moving forward. And then, of course, it's always, reminding everybody the progress we made this year and what we want to make sure we're doing next year, and keeping that progress moving forward. I'm encouraging more and more people that run the meetings to use the meeting assistant, because that AI note taker is so helpful, and in gathering what it is they say and creating next steps, I think is super important. So I think those are the things that I want to make sure that I'm kind of on top of moving forward. And then I think even beyond that is now let's look at some subgroups. Let's look at, maybe we're just looking at our boys. What's happening with our boys? Or maybe we're just looking at our really high level kids, using MTSS as a way to kind of really move the needle on groups within groups. I think that's where I see things moving.
Well, I love this talk of just all this progress that you have made in the 2 years since I've talked to you, because I remember that conversation, and you just talked about being new and getting to know people and building those relationships, and how I can see that that's carried you along the way and allowed the progress to happen and people to start to believe in that work. Because I do think that's so much a part of buy-in, is getting people to believe in the work. And I think celebrating your success and sharing it, I think, is a big part of it. And sounds like that's what you're doing, and you're being
trying. I'm trying. Yeah, it's always, and listen, I have a fantastic team. I'm supported, but the superintendent supports obviously the program. The assistant superintendents support the program. I work with the building principals very closely, the assistant principals. So it's never just one person. I've always known that in education, there's no I in team. There's just none. So I'm alone in my position, but I work closely with everybody, and that's really what we're all here for. In the end, we're all here to work better together so that the students benefit from it. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm excited to share this with you
again.
You're welcome.
All right. Take care.